came in week 6 and we had a problem with that because my wife was having issues with a muscle fund. She's a 2010 and maybe a pinch muscle. So we dealt with that, got some MRIs and stuff. So we were delayed another 3 days. So we get here on Tuesday. And as glad as we were, we really need a Monday, Sunday. say that whole time. The weather was great.
It's right across the street.
Interesting experience.
Yeah.
Just the nightlife, of course, the
There is
different
Oh, sure, it's beautiful. It's right in the
Start
same area.
Yes,
It's right in the
yes, yeah.
we worked on it. We worked on it a couple of weeks before, and that worked really well. Parkland was really nice. On the 6th of February, we didn't see him. Stayed in the suite and checked in everything. We could see just being sick.
Yeah.
2 areas of things. We traveled fast train a couple. And of course, they've been going there. Pan American Exhibition. So they had all these places they would like to see again. And
Yeah.
to show them.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good place. Yeah, yeah.
That's
My
terrific.
grandfather sold
Did you spend a certain amount of time with your daughter also?
Yes,
Yeah.
most days she was between semesters. So the main thing she had to do was finish up on grading buildings for organizing staff.
But the original architect,
Some of them are still
That's great.
it's like a neoclassical style. The original building, and there was another building built. And then the newest building. So it's 3 sections.
Right.
Most places is the
No, that wasn't there. Right in the city, right in the same area. Right in the same. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So it was just delightful. And of course, the balloons and words on the end. Hoping that's what it was.
Yes.
And it was.
Okay, good. That's terrific.
So she felt better the next day.
I know. I didn't read that one, but I read another one.
So it was terrible.
Frank Lloyd Wright.
Yeah.
Next year we're planning to go see friends and relatives. The ex-wife of Frank Lloyd Wright.
That's the one that I read.
Come on up. Good morning. Welcome to the Science Group. We're happy to see you, on this, what looks like it's going to be a nice day, and we hope we can start it off well for you. My name is Bob Spiritus. I coordinate these talks. Bob Hopper was our greeter in the back. He's still greeting people there. And we're happy to have Dr. Bob Davidson present today on the title of chemical safety. Dr. Davidson received a BS in Chemical Engineering from Washington U in St. Louis, a PhD from the University of Wisconsin. He worked for Eastman Kodak for 3 years, and then for 36 years he worked for 3M. He also gained experience in global regulation compliance and process safety standards. In 2017, he received the American Institute of Chemical Engineers Industrial Research and Development Award. At 3M, he developed patented processes, and he has worked in important areas with that chemical company. In retirement, he has also been active in outreach activities as a mentor to Boys and Girls Clubs, and as a 25-year 3M visiting wizard performing demonstrations for over 4,000 students. He's tutored students in preparation for AP exams, and is the founder of Boy Scout Explorer Posts in Chemistry and Chemical Engineering. Please welcome Dr. Bob Davidson.
Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you about chemical safety and how important it is to all of us as I give you a very quick walk through about 100 years of how we got to where we are. Come on. What happened? There we go. Okay, let's start with what is chemistry? And the definition that I like is that chemistry is part of science that focuses on materials and their properties and their uses and how we can transform one material into another to make something that we hope will be beneficial to our needs. And chemistry in this day and age touches every part of your life, from healthcare to transportation, food, clothing, shelter, construction, you name it. There's hardly any part of our lives that isn't affected in some way by chemistry, which is a wonderful thing, but on the other hand, chemistry can also do harm. And depending on the scale, some of these harms can be really harmful. And they fall into kind of two categories. There's process incidents that come during manufacture and storage of materials. And these result in unintended consequences and material releases and fires and explosions. And then there's the other kind of harm that comes from the improper use or release of chemicals. So I'm going to briefly go through some of these examples so you get a better idea of what I'm talking about. And I'll start with the harm that can come from process incidents. And I'll talk about three in particular because they're really important in the history of the development of chemical safety protocols and regulations. The first one I'll mention is happened in Flicksborough in the United Kingdom back in 1974. There was a plant that made a material used to make nylon, and they had an issue, and some things broke, and they released a cloud of 100,000 pounds of a solvent, and the cloud drifted around until it got to an ignition source, and I don't think they ever figured out what. It could be an exhaust on a car, it could be an electrical line, and it caused an explosion equivalent to about 20 tons of TNT, and this is what the plant looked like right after the explosion. It killed 28 workers, 100 more were injured, and it made about 200 homes in the surrounding area uninhabitable. And it was of such a scale that the British government had a court of inquiry to look into what happened and how they could prevent it in the future. And what they found was that in the plant there were these 6 reactors, and the material traveled from one to the next, and reactor 5 needed some maintenance. So they shut down the plant, they took out the reactor, and then they put a pipe from 4 to 6. But in their hurry, they didn't design the pipe quite right, and they didn't install it quite right. And when the plant started up, the pipe broke, and 100,000 pounds of solvent went out into the atmosphere and exploded. The next one that I'll mention that also caused huge changes in the European modes of chemical safety happened in Seveso, Italy in 1976. This was a plant that was operating nicely, and they shut it down for the weekend. But they didn't shut it down quite right, and so the reaction didn't quite stop. And it was unattended, and it started back up, and it went very slowly, but as it went, it generated energy, which made it warmer, which made the reaction go faster, until finally it was going so rapidly that it built up such pressure in the reactor that it vented, and it spewed its contents out into the world. And the chemical they were making is not great, but it's not that harmful. But a byproduct is a material called dioxin that was, a number of years ago, was in the news a lot. And you might remember it. It's really, really, really toxic at very, very low concentrations. And it spread throughout the area. And it immediately killed a lot of animals. And it contaminated, it was in an agricultural part of the country, and it contaminated the animals, it contaminated the plants, it got on people, and on people nobody died as far as I know, but they got a disease called chloracne, a condition of their skin, and this is a picture of a boy who has it. And it's pretty horrible, but it does kind of clear up eventually. However, there was a long-term stigma because of the contamination in the area, so that people in the rest of Italy did not want to buy anything from this area in Italy for a very long time. And for those that were contaminated, they had an increased cancer risk for years and years and years. The third one that I will tell you about happened in Bhopal, India. And this still has the distinction of being the worst industrial accident in recorded history. They had a large storage tank that had a material in it called methyl isocyanate, or MIC for short, and somehow water got in the tank, and where it never should have been, and the water reacted with the chemical, and it caused a reaction that built up a lot of pressure, and it caused a venting, and all of this material spread to the neighborhood. Well, India has a huge number of people there, and it contaminated about 500,000 people. And more than 2,000 of them died within hours, and more than 20,000 died in the next few years. And now, 40 years later, this is still a problem. There is still legal and political wrangling over the incident and who's responsible and who should pay for what. And the people just keep suffering, and the area still hasn't been cleaned up. So this is the worst industrial accident in recorded history. So this gives you a sense of what the scale of harm can be if a chemical plant has an incident. So we don't want these to happen. The harms from improper use or release of chemicals happen on different scales. One that affects all of us directly is the injury to uninformed people. You can buy pesticides, herbicides, cleaning agents, all kinds of chemicals at the grocery store or the hardware store, and just because you can buy them doesn't mean they're safe. When you use these things, be sure to really read the instructions and do what it says. If it says wear gloves, wear gloves. If you need ventilation, have ventilation. And if a little works well, don't assume that a lot of it works better. That's not necessarily a good idea. And above all, don't start mixing things together to try and get better effects. One of the things that happens pretty much every year to some people is they have chlorine bleach, which is a great cleaner, and they have ammonia cleaners in their house, which is another great cleaner, and they decide they'll mix them together and get something even better for a harder to get out stain. The trouble is chlorine bleach and ammonia react and make a very toxic gas called chloramine. And if you get a small whiff of it, you get irritation of your nose and throat and lungs. But if you get a large enough dose of it, it can in fact kill you. So use chemicals wisely read the instructions and don't start mixing things together. But the more harmful part of improper use of chemicals is by people who should know better. How many of you remember hearing about Love Canal? Yeah, lots of us. The story of Love Canal is a very long, sad story. It began back in 1892 when William Love proposed building a canal to link two parts of the Niagara River so that here's Niagara Falls, so you can't actually travel by boat from one side to the other side. So he was going to build this canal, and he started the project and built about 3,000 feet of this big hole in the ground. But then the project failed and the hole was left there. So 50 years later, Hooker Chemical got permission to dispose of their chemical wastes. Hooker Chemical was a big chemical concern in Niagara Falls. And they started filling it up, and after a little more than 10 years, they had put in 42 million pounds of their chemical wastes. And then the city of Niagara, and the Niagara School Board in particular, said, we would like the land because we need more places for schools and houses. And so Hooker said, this is not a good idea, but the city used their powers of eminent domain and says, well, we would like it. So Hooker says, don't give us a good price for it. You have to give us something. We'll take $1, and in return, the city got a certificate saying this was filled with dangerous chemicals. Don't ever build anything here. But people didn't follow that warning, and they built the school and they built the houses. And by the 1970s, the clay cover over all of the waste started to deteriorate, and it began to ooze out and made a lot of people sick, and the school closed, the houses were evacuated, and in 1980, President Carter stepped in and declared a state of emergency for the area, which was the first time that public money had been used to try and remediate what happened from something other than a natural disaster like hurricanes and tornadoes. So how can events like these be avoided? The philosopher George Santayana famously said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And so the best way to not do these things again is to make sure we know about what happened before. And for thousands of years, people have used regulations as a way to remember what happened before and provide an impetus for people to not do those sorts of things again. Because a regulation has two parts. The first part codifies what happened and the best practices for avoiding it. And then the second part is that portion provides information in a way it can be passed along to future practitioners. And then the second part of a regulation is to provide laws and mechanisms for ensuring that people don't do what they're not supposed to do. And the earliest ones that I've been able to come up with date back, millennia. The Code of Hammurabi had a building code. The Bible has a building code. And for millennia, it was building codes, construction regulations that proliferated, around the world. But then came the Industrial Revolution, and now we had lots of other new kinds of hazards, and they caused problems. The Industrial Revolution was initially powered by steam power, and to get steam, you need a boiler, and boilers at the time tended to blow up, so steamships and trains and things always had problems. So in 1880, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers said, we have to do something about this. So they identified this need for engineering standards for how things should be built and tested and operated in the area of boilers. And they started this code for steam boilers. In 1914, it got broadened to a national scale, and today this code is now 14,000 pages long. It's really important to the chemical industry because lots and lots of chemical processes are done at a pressure above atmospheric pressure. And needless to say, at 14,000 pages, you need people whose focus is this code. I mean, when I was working, we always had somebody, when we had a pressure vessel, we had somebody to go to that knew what part of the code we should read to make sure everything was built and installed and operated correctly. And so you say, well, okay, that's nice for industry, but what do I care about pressure vessels? Well, there are lots of pressure vessels in your life, and you depend on them operating safely. If you have a residential boiler for hot water heat, you have a pressure vessel. If you have a hot water tank, you have a pressure vessel. And you rely on the fact that these industries that make and install these are well developed and they follow all the rules, and you never worry about these things in your basement. Every one of us also uses a very small pressure vessel all the time, and that's a soda pop can. Because a soda pop can, depending on the kind of soda pop and the temperature, can have a pressure inside of about 55 psi, pounds force per square inch. And a can is pretty small. It has very few square inches, only 48 of them. But that means that there's a force inside that pop can of 26,000 pounds trying to blow the can apart. And so every time you pick up a pop can now, you can thank the people that understand how to design and build and manufacture pressure vessels. The next one that came about was the electrical safety code. We rely on electricity all the time. We take it for granted because there are rules for how you build the equipment, how you install it, and how you operate it that are widely followed. And so we don't even think twice about using it. And again, this is really important for the chemical industry because chemicals, lots and lots of them are highly flammable, and you don't want any sparks and arcs and things to set off fires and explosions. So where do these regulations come from? How do they come about? Because maintaining safety is not just a technical problem. It has a technical dimension, but there's a societal dimension of awareness among the population. There's a political dimension. There's one from business, and there's one from economics. And maintaining safety is actually a really complicated issue that has a lot of conflicting incentives amongst the groups involved. But it boils down to the fact that changes in safety protocols come from responses to tragedies. And when there's a tragedy, you get people looking at it, and they get new perspectives from the individuals about what it means and how to deal with it. And that can lead to changes in societal awareness. And as soon as people become, as a society on a larger scale, aware of something and concerned about having it not happen again, then the next group that has to get involved is actually government, because you need some way on a large scale to be able to have these rules, make the information available, and make sure there's a way to get people to follow the rules for safety. I'll introduce you to 4 people that had pivotal roles in the development of the chemical safety rules. The first one is Rachel Carson. She was a marine biologist and was nationally known for her radio spots and her books about marine biology. But in 1962, she published a book on a completely different subject. Her book was called Silent Spring, and it dealt with chemical safety, particularly of pesticides. And it was very well researched, but the chemical industry at the time tried really hard to discredit her. But luckily, they were not successful in doing that, because she documented the effects of chemicals on living things and the environment, a new perspective. I mean, people had thought, well, accidents happen, there's nothing we can do about it. And her book deserves to be read today. If you've read it before, read it again. If you've never read it, I recommend that you do so. The part of the book that really caught the public's attention was a small section about eagles, because our national bird was disappearing. And she pointed out the research that DDT had been tested and it does not affect birds, at least not in the ways that people originally looked at it, because they looked at, chemicals can burn you, they can poison you immediately and have all kinds of quick negative effects, and it didn't have any of this. But what people did figure out is that DDT in an eagle changed some of their internal systems and caused them to lay eggs with very, very thin shells. So when they incubated the eggs, the eagle sits on the egg, the shell breaks, and no chick can hatch. And so the eagle population was going away. And one of the principal things that her book points out is that the chemical cause and the biological effect of that chemical can be widely separated in time and in space. And other topics that she talks about we're learning more and more about how important they are. One of the ones is that the transport of chemicals by air and water is much easier and a much larger effect than people thought. This is coming up a lot today. I'm sure you've heard of PFAS, perfluoro and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They are found everywhere on the globe, from pole to pole, everywhere, even though they're not used anywhere near the poles. So it has transferred everywhere. And she pointed out another thing, a lot of other things. Here's another one that we're really understanding the importance, and that is that repeated chemical exposure can lead to developed resistance in target species, but the resistance depends a lot on the generation length of the species. When we get exposed, our generation length is like 25 years, and so we adapt really, really, really slowly to anything. Viruses and bacteria have generation lengths on the order of minutes, and so they adapt really fast. And so that's why we have drug-resistant diseases now, because they have adapted very quickly to the chemicals that are designed to kill them. And so part of her warning is that time is an essential ingredient in life and maintaining it, but in the modern world there is no time because things turn over and change so rapidly. The second person I'll introduce you to, I'm sure you've never heard of unless you're a chemical engineer, and his name is Trevor Kletz, and he's the father of process safety analysis. He was an industrial chemist in the UK, and he looked around at his company's plants, and bad things were happening regularly. And he said, this shouldn't be. And so he convinced his management to make him the first technical safety advisor to go around and work specifically on how do they improve the way they handle and manufacture chemicals. And so he championed the use of something called hazard and operability analysis and the idea is that when you have the idea for a chemical plant, you start before it's designed and built and look at what can happen, how can I mitigate any hazards from it, and build that all in from the very beginning and continue that along while it operates. And he also developed the idea of inherently safer plants that are designed so that they can't do certain hazardous things. And so part of his methodology for an inherently safer design is don't have hazardous things around. What you don't have, you cannot release, and it cannot explode, and you can't have problems from it. So he was a big advocate for having very small plants, don't use hazardous things when you don't have to, design around all of this. And he was also instrumental in coming up with better ways to remember the lessons of the past and pass them along. The last two individuals I'll introduce you to are Paul Anastas and John Warner. You might have heard of the term green chemistry. Anybody heard green chemistry? Okay. It's still a relatively new trend in chemistry, and it started out as coming out of the Environmental Protection Agency and the people that worked with them. So at the time that these people did their work, Paul Anastas worked at EPA, and John Warner was an independent chemist at a company, but he did a lot of work with them. And these two people published a book in 2000 called Green Chemistry, Theory and Practice that is too slowly, actually, but it is changing the way we teach chemists and teach engineers and operate in the chemical industry. Their principles are that don't treat waste later, prevent it in the first place. Develop less hazardous chemical syntheses at the beginning stage when the chemist has it, even before it's an idea that it might become a plant someday. Design safer chemicals that are built-in biodegradable, that are built in with less toxicity than alternatives. And along with Trevor Klutz, they're very much in favor of inherently safer chemistry and safer plants, and to use renewable rather than depleting materials and energy. So that's some of the individuals that have made a big difference in chemical safety. And next I'll talk to you about some of the events that really changed societal awareness. One of them that made a really big impact in 1969 was the Cuyahoga River. By that point, it was so polluted, nothing lived in it. There were no fish, there were no plants. It was pretty much dead as it flowed through Cleveland. And it used to catch fire. And it caught fire fairly regularly, actually. But the fire in 1969, this is not the fire in 69. I couldn't find a picture of that one. This one was in 1952. But it caught fire in 1969. And this time, it made national news instead of just local news, because it was symbolic of the plight of a lot of the rivers in the country. They were so polluted, nothing lived in it, and they would periodically catch fire. And so this had a big impact on people's awareness of the hazards of chemicals. And the next one that had a tremendous impact was Earth Day, the first Earth Day in April 22nd, 1970. Senator Gaylord Nelson, not as a government function, but kind of on his own, says it's time to make sure people are more aware of chemical hazards in their life. And so he had the idea of having a national teach-in. And it was kind of his idea, but then a lot of other people joined in to organize it. And I think even they were surprised at the response, because on that day, more than 20 million people hit the streets of the United States saying, we really want a healthy, sustainable environment. And so this change in societal awareness had an enormous effect on chemical safety, because it got the attention of the government. Richard Nixon was president at the time, and Richard Nixon was not a terribly enthusiastic environmental supporter. However, he was a very astute politician, and he said, when 20 million people will hit the streets one day on this topic, we need to do something. And so he and Congress got together in a bipartisan manner and started looking into how we could change this and passing legislation for regulations to codify the problems and provide enforcement against it. So in 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency started That same year, this was a very busy year in Congress, the Clean Air Act passed, the Occupational Safety and Health Act passed. A couple years later, the Clean Water Act passed, and then a few years after that, the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, as you might have heard of it, passed to regulate chemicals in commerce. And this continued on in a more subdued fashion for quite a long time. And I'll mention this other one called the United States Chemical Safety Board that got its start in 1990. It is the only world body, it's the only body in the world that is dedicated to investigating the causes of chemical incidents in industry and recommending improvements. As you might imagine, from seeing the picture of Bhopal and the picture of Flicksboro, it's really hard after an incident to figure out what happened. It takes a lot of expertise in fields like metallurgical failure and all kinds of experience to be able to look at that and interview people and come back and figure out what caused it in the first place. So what can we do about it? So that happened in 1990. So this chart kind of summarizes 100 years of chemical safety. I didn't put any of the incidents here because there were lots of them and they were mostly just local news. Or, oh well, it's an accident, it happens. But you know, here's the electrical code and the boiler code. Here's Silent Spring, here's the Cuyahoga Fire, here's Earth Day. And Earth Day resulted in OSHA, EPA, clean air, clean water, safe drinking water, and all of those things. Here's Seveso that changed things in Europe, which I won't go into. Here's Love Canal, and an outgrowth of that is the Superfund legislation that for the first time was legislation to have the chemical industry responsible for things they had done in the past and do it on a national scale. There's a tax on chemical companies to put money into a fund, the Superfund, for future use to help mitigate problems from past actions. And this goes on to today. I also have to mention the business and economic dimensions of chemical safety. Their focus is generally really short term, which is kind of a problem when you deal with long-term consequences. And it's very difficult to quantify future benefits and costs. And so you often hear, but it's really easy to calculate the cost of implementing a regulation today. That businesses can do that very quickly. What's it going to cost me today? But it's hard to figure out what the benefit might be in the costs and benefits in the future. So you often hear the argument that regulations are too burdensome and too costly and they kill jobs. And it's very hard to tell. And it's even hard to find information retrospectively. I did find this information about the effects of the Clean Air Act. This center group of lines are things that go along with the size of the US population, okay? These two lines are GDP and vehicle miles traveled. And so that's kind of a surrogate measure of how is the overall economy doing. And so the population grew a little, economic activity grew a lot. And this line down here is the aggregate emissions of 6 important contaminants that were regulated by the Clean Air Act. And they have steadily gone down, or at least steadily through 2015, which is when this data ends. And so I think you can all look around in your lives and see the water's cleaner, the air is cleaner. It has helped our lives. It's helped, asthma sufferers. It has helped all kinds of things. And that's because this line has gone down. And if it's had an effect on the economy, it certainly hasn't been a terribly negative one. One of the things about business and economic analysis is that they don't consider what economists call externalities, which are costs to third parties. Like Love Canal, what is the cost to the people who were impacted by all of the chemicals oozing out of the ground? In Bhopal, what is the cost over 40, 50, 60 years to the population that was exposed to it? Those are hard to quantify, and they're generally not considered. So that there's, those kinds of things are not built into corporate decisions on, do I do this or do I not do this? So chemical safety needs keep changing because serious incidents continue to happen, although serious incidents in the chemical industry are down a lot over what they were before all of these regulations started. But there's always new materials being invented, things like nanoparticles and monoclonal antibodies and other biological agents. And we're getting new scientific understanding about the hazards and the long-term hazards. We now know a lot more about genetics and something called epigenetics, which is not changes in your DNA, but it's changes in the way your DNA causes your body to act that can be passed along to your children. And these can be affected by chemicals as well. And so there are groups mainly in academia, a few in industry, who are focused on developing approaches to be able to adapt to all of these changes more quickly than we have in the past and in better ways. So, what will the future hold for chemical safety? I don't know. I am personally worried at the moment because the safety culture in the country is under stress. There have been lots of changes in government policy to weaken regulations and eliminate entire functions so that even for agencies that still exist with the same things, same documents, they don't have people to act as repositories of information and gather new information and disseminate it. In the latest version of the White House budget, the Chemical Safety Board is eliminated entirely, which is in fact a move that's opposed by the chemical industry because they rely on having this group of experts who can go into after a disaster, after an incident, and figure out what happened so that they know not to do it in the future, because it's a really hard thing to figure out. And there's research at universities that have shown for a variety of different industries that in general self-policing doesn't work. If there's nobody who is independent and knowledgeable looking for problems, there's no real way to enforce the safety regulations. A countervailing tendency is for chemist education and engineer education and efforts at least some parts of industry to implement green chemical principles to make things that are inherently less toxic, less hazardous. Is that going to be enough to counteract all of these other things? I have no idea. So I don't know for sure what's going to happen. But I can tell you that chemical safety is a socio-technical problem. It depends a lot on society, and it's everybody's responsibility. Everybody who works in the chemical industry, and also it's the responsibility of all of us citizens, because our choices define the environment politically and regulatorily and the environment we live in, and will affect our future. So each of us has a part in keeping us all safe. So thank you very much. That's my story.
Thanks, Bob. As many of you know, now is your turn. Please come up to the microphone if you have a question. We record these discussions, and unless we can hear it through the microphone, we won't be able to capture it. So ask your questions, please, and Bob will defend them, and I'll get out of the way.
Good morning. Thank you
Good
for
morning.
your talk. It was wonderful and frightening. I have 2 degrees in chemistry. I worked for American Cyanamide in Princeton, New Jersey, and I left a year later. Every woman, this is back in 1976, every woman had miscarriages. Men were dying. They were proud of the new molecules they made. And OSHA was not very strong, the Occupational Safety and Housing Authority. So they didn't care if something was going to become a chemical that they're going to sell. They didn't care where you ran it. I'm 5 feet tall. They gave me a kickstand. I was making new molecules, and I had to climb into my hood, which kind of defeats the purpose of having a hood. Yes. And I stopped after a year because I knew that it was going to affect my health. My question to you is, it was in Princeton, New Jersey, and it was right on Route 1 and by Quaker Bridge Mall, and it closed down. I don't know when, because I would come back to that area. I lived in northern New Jersey. How do you find out what existed where they put houses? And so those kids, I mean, all the products that we made that we thought might be sellable were put on the ground, and now that company building is gone, and they're putting houses there. What does that mean for the people? How can you find out what existed where they built new houses?
That's a really complicated question. And
Of course it is. I don't know how to do anything simple.
I don't know how you find out. I mean, even for Love Canal, where it was oozing out on the ground, it was still really hard to find out. This is the externality economic problem, that all of these other effects are never considered. And there's currently no way in our legal system to really get this to happen. And companies are reluctant to say anything, and then they go out of business, and then there may be no one left who knows. And the Chemical Safety Board and a lot of these other agencies are chronically underfunded, and because of the legal framework of our country, a lot of the regulatory agencies have turned more into adversarial relationships when they weren't originally intended to do that. They were intended mainly to do the documentation and facilitation and best practices and dissemination of information. But that's not how it's turned out, because we have such an adversarial relationship between industry and anything that gets in its way.
Yeah,
And it's still a huge problem. I mean, I worked for 3M, which was one of the leading manufacturers of PFASs. And when I started, there was general agreement that these materials were so inert they weren't going to cause problems for anybody. And that's not the case. And when it turned out that there was evidence that they were found globally, 3M was the first company to stop making some of them. Not all of them, but some of them. The ones that seemed to have spread the furthest quickest.
Right.
But it's also turning out that they knew there were harms from them decades before it came to public awareness. And so, I mean, I think 3M is a good corporation that oftentimes did the right thing,
Right.
but even they did not in all cases. This is my personal view. Don't tell the corporation.
You know, I thought it was really interesting. I really enjoyed the work I did it was using all the chemistry I learned in college, but I kept feeling really sick, realizing that climbing into the hood was the worst thing I could do, because every hood and place that you're doing your research is made for a man that's 5'10", and I'm 5 feet tall. And I'm glad I left after a year, and thank you. And I went and got certified to teach, and I taught for over 25 years. I've created a lot of chemists, a lot of doctors. Their parents blame me for them going to medical school. I didn't, I just made them excited about chemistry. But it's really scary because they didn't care if it was going to be come to market. They didn't care where you ran it. You ran it outside a hood, anywhere. And they pushed, oh gosh. And I said, this is not good.
As of when I retired in 2017, a lot of those thoughts had kind of gone away, I think.
Well, yes.
And so the workplace became a whole lot safer by the end of my career than the beginning
Yeah.
of my career.
I had people that I worked with that were proud of making, I'm sorry, anyhow. Thank
Okay.
you very much. I'm sorry that we can't figure out when you go to buy a house whether it's toxic.
I don't know how to tell either.
I have a couple comments on safety.
Okay.
The first is, if a law is passed, corporations put it into their policy. When OSHA comes to inspect, they inspect your policy book. Rarely do they go downrange through the production facility. And when you go through a production facility, you see problems that aren't even in the regulations. And oh, by the way, in 25 to 30 years, people forget, why are we doing this? Because it may be in some of the regulations, but it's lost. The laws are incorporated into other laws that don't carry the reason for that regulation, and that's a problem. Right. The second problem is management has to get out to pick up those things that aren't in law. And I'll give you one quick example. All of you have propellant in your cars. That's what generates your airbag. And that propellant is about the size of a thumbnail. And if you go through, propellant is made in, if you've ever baked a cake, imagine a machine 10 times bigger than what you have at home that mixes the propellant. So I once asked an employee, how do you know it's finished? And
Sir, please ask a question.
All right.
Okay, we've heard a speech. Now it's time to ask questions.
Okay.
Not give another speech.
I just wanted to point out that there are still issues that need to be resolved. And what are your recommendations to resolve it?
Oh, I agree that they need to be solved, and I'm afraid I don't have really good recommendations. For a while, I was on the safety committee at work, and I tried to make it so that our hazard reviews were hazard reviews instead of regulatory reviews. So it takes everybody on both the corporate side, top to bottom, and the regulatory side to make sure that that becomes the focus instead of just compliance and ticking off the boxes so that the lawyers don't get involved.
To make things even more complicated, that when we pass good regulations here, and they're just in the US to make things safe, our companies like Union Carbide go to places like India where there either are no regulations or they're not enforced. Then I was working in the State Department when that happened. The ambassador was a wonderful, competent person. But because of Bhopal, your reputations and mine were damaged in the whole country of India. We weren't able to do important things we were trying to do. And who cares? Who knows? So I've realized that with the government we have now, we're not going to pass any more regulations anyway. But we need international regulations so that you can't just skip out. But there's no mechanism. We're in a boatload of trouble because we can't regulate things. Yeah. And I fear things are only going to get worse. What do you think?
I am afraid they're going to get worse. They have gotten a lot better, but I'm afraid they're going to get worse again. And I don't know, but it's a complicated societal problem. It's not just a technical problem. Yes, please.
I just have a comment about the Union Carbide and the Bhopal. The Indian government allowed their facility to be built by Union Carbide, but demanded that the people working there were all Indian. And they were taught how to do the safety, but they weren't the people that really knew the safety. And it happened because the Indians were in place instead of any U.S. supervisors.
Yeah,
I have a question.
sure. I may not have an answer.
Our system of regulation is built preemptively. It requires agencies that try to stay ahead, and you talk about the 14,000 pages of pressurized containers. Is there room for a paradigm shift where instead of trying to stay ahead and identify every detail of what is wrong, what should be, and all of that, that ties it into consequences that raise liabilities if it is done improperly, so that it works into the capitalist system to make it to their advantage to do things the right way that they might figure out better than a regulator or a legislation vehicle could?
I believe that's actually the best way to do it, but that's the externality problem, and that's the part that is not part of any of the systems, really. All of that stuff is just ignored, and then when something happens, that's just a business expense that you write off. And if you can come up with a way to put externalities into the thinking ahead of time, that would be great. There is an example that I know about of a company that actually kind of felt that way for a while. DuPont started off in the explosives business, and for many, many years when I started my career, they had the best safety record of anybody in the world, because the culture of the company was, we are doing hazardous things and it's our responsibility to make sure that nothing happens. But that gradually dissipated, and now they're no different from any other corporation as far as I can tell. But that would be a really good thing, is to bake that into the thinking and the incentives originally across society, across the world. Yes, please.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you for the presentation. This is very informative. I worked in the chemical industry for 40 years. I retired in 2016. And a lot of the things that you talk about, process safety management, hazard reviews, incident reviews, those were really critical in the work that I did, because we were designing and developing, starting and operating chemical plants. So the fact that that is diminishing or being reduced is really alarming, because it does create the history of, we did this, this is what happened, this was an incident, this is what we learned from the incident, how can we do the hazards analysis better, and all that sort of thing. And so if we start losing that, we're going to have more and more problems. So how do we know, and what do we do to ensure that some of those agencies, because things wouldn't happen if it weren't for regulation. Right. And it did have to be confrontational, because the companies wouldn't do it unless they were forced to do it. And that's the way it is. So if that's not happening, that's going to be a real big problem. So how did you come with the information that these things are being reduced, cut back, eliminate? Chemical Safety Board, it's a wonderful service to the chemical industry.
Yeah. I think you're right. Things could get really bad again. I don't really know how to change it. Well, I guess I do know. You have to have 20 million people hit the streets one day.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that'll change it.
Thank
you. Well, you could write it.
Hi, I actually have a question that you might be able to answer. Thank you for your presentation. As a person who tries in my personal behavior to be a good environmental steward. I do all this stuff. But my question is the following. We all have eaten out and taken food out of restaurants in these plastic containers. I try to bring my containers to the restaurant to have them get reused so I don't take another one. Am I having my breakfast in this? Is that harming? Is that putting plastics? It's not cooked in it. I don't cook in plastic.
Yeah, don't cook in them.
No, I never do. But eating my granola and yogurt and fruit, is that releasing more toxin into my old body?
I have to say now that I don't know.
Oh.
If you'd asked me a few years ago, I would have said, that's fine, we do it too. But from everything I'm reading these days, the tiny bits of plastic that flake off.
Shed? Really? Even
Yeah, I mean, I didn't think they would shed, but I mean, I don't know. So
Okay.
at home, we try and do things mainly in glass and stainless steel, but we still use those a whole lot. And I don't know the answer to that question anymore.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Bob. I think businesses may often think about liability and risk containment as a broader topic, not just chemical safety.
Right.
But couldn't that give us two entry points to increase a culture of safety? The first would be, as first-time corporate board members are appointed, if they have not done like a 1-hour overview of appropriate safety culture, a professional society could offer that. The other implementation could be MBA programs could have like 2 hours on safety culture, including chemical safety. So is this happening? And if it's not happening in the US, is it happening in any other country? That's my question.
I think that's a really good idea. I mentioned DuPont when they were an explosive manufacturer. They had a safety culture that did its job, top to bottom. That's gone away. I don't really know how to get it back and how to spread it widely. But it's the culture that really makes the difference. If it goes from top to bottom, that's what really makes the difference. And I don't really know how to do that. Yes.
My question is a little more practical. The question, we are inundated with chemicals. The question is, what can we personally do to try to avoid them? For example, I try to buy only food that's organically grown. Look at chemicals, I mean toothpaste, everything that we touch almost, you can inundate us with some unknown chemical or chemical that's going to be very detrimental. So I would like to see a list, someone generate a list of what we could do on an everyday basis to minimize our intake of chemicals, because we're not going to avoid having them. If you look at advertisements on TV for medicines, you know, all these chemicals in these various medicines they're trying to sell us. Anyway, that was my point. We need to know how to live our day-to-day lives by minimizing chemical input.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I don't really know how to do that. I mean, I read the labels myself, and half the time, unless I go home and look up everyone in the chemistry books, I don't know what half this stuff is. I don't know.
I have a very easy question.
Well, you know, the labeling and a lot of a lot of home products these days are in fact a lot safer than they used to be, because companies are aware of this problem. But I don't really know how to do it on a really large, thorough scale. Yes.
I have a very simple question. Products like Weed Be Gone. I've read that it's harmful to humans. But then I go to places like Home Depot and Lowe's, and those products are all over the place. What's the deal with Weed Be Gone and those type of weed-killing substances?
Yeah, they're everywhere. Just because they're there doesn't mean they're safe. I try and read the labels and pick ones that I can tell are safer than some of the other ones. It's hard for me. It would be nigh unto impossible for most of you. The best thing you can do is, and I mean, even Rachel Carson says, I'm not against pesticides and herbicides, just use them cautiously and sparingly. So use them cautiously, use them sparingly. Don't do it if you can just pull a couple weeds today. Don't bother spraying your whole lawn. And wear the gloves, use good ventilation, wash up afterwards, and don't take the contents and just dispose of it in the garbage when you're done. Most cities these days have a way to dispose of hazardous waste at least like once a year or something. Dispose of the leftovers that way. That will help us all out. But these are really complicated societal problems, and I don't have good solutions. Sorry. Yes.
Hi, this is not a question, it's a comment, but I think it's really important for people to know that in the last couple of months, the US EPA's Office of Research and Development, so those are the people that do the health research on air pollutants, water pollutants, safe drinking water, all of this stuff, was completely eliminated. 80% of the employees have been terminated, and the ones that are left are going to be transferred into approving new chemicals. So all of the science underneath the regulations you have for drinking water and air pollution and everything is all gone and will fade away at some point. And the regulation that EPA had going through the system on PFAS, it was halfway through to getting done. Done. So you can't assume that there will be new environmental regulations that will help protect you, and a lot of the old ones might go away.
That's my worry.
Right, our Congress people, our
Yes.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
We are so lucky at Chautauqua to have resident experts who can talk about these complicated things and not charge you and I $15,000 to do the talk. But we still need money to put on these programs. We still have a basket at the back. And put something nice in there for us. Thank you.
Please come back next week. Dr. Stephen Still will talk about robo-taxis, and should be interesting. So we hope to see you then. Once again, thanks to Bob, and have a good day at Chautauqua.